Hey there, Psych 370 students, and welcome to your first video lecture for week 13. Guys, we've spent the last few weeks of the course focusing on reinforcement, but this week we're going to shift over to punishment, which is the topic of chapter 8 of your textbook. So that's your reading assignment for this week, and that chapter basically includes four major sections. It describes some of the variables that influence how effective a given punisher is. It talks about some of the problematic side effects that can result from the use of punishment. It discusses a few theories of punishment, and then it concludes with a section on alternatives to punishment. So I have a video lecture for you about each of those topics. And in this one, which will definitely be the longest of the four, I'll be talking mainly about variables that influence the effectiveness of a punisher. First, though, let's review what punishment is. So remember, it's the opposite of reinforcement, right? So, whereas reinforcement always involves an increase in the strength of a behavior due to its consequences, punishment always involves a decrease, a weakening of a behavior due to its consequences. So, if you do something that causes something aversive or undesirable to happen, or if you do something that causes something pleasant to not happen, and then you stop performing that behavior as a result, then we'd say that that behavior has gotten punished. And of course, depending on the nature of the consequence, we could classify that instance as a case of positive punishment or negative punishment. So if your behavior got weaker because it caused the appearance of a new stimulus or an increase in the intensity of an existing stimulus, then that would be positive punishment. So, for example, if touching a metal doorknob causes you to receive a painful static electric shock, and then you become less likely to touch metal doorknobs with your bare hands in the future, then we call that positive punishment because the shock was added. But punishment can also occur by subtraction. So, in negative punishment, a behavior gets weaker because it causes the removal or the prevention of something you'd rather not have removed or prevented. So, for example, if I make a mean comment about my mother in law, and then as a result, my wife stops talking to me for a while, then I'll probably become less likely to say mean things about my mother in law in the future, right? And so that would be an example of negative punishment because my behavior of making mean comments has gotten weaker due to the subtraction of my wife talking to me. So, anyway, punishment is a decrease in the strength of a behavior due to its consequences. We also make this distinction between positive punishment and negative punishment. And that stuff should be familiar because we went over it a few weeks ago, but it's a good place for us to start, I think, as far as our coverage of punishment goes. But now that we've reviewed what punishment is, let's move on and start talking about some of the factors that influence its effectiveness. Now, guys, the fact that I'm talking about increasing or decreasing the effectiveness of a punisher at all obviously implies that punishers are effective under some conditions. But it's kind of interesting that that hasn't always been the prevailing view in psychology. So, for example, both Thorndike and Skinner were of the opinion that punishers didn't work. They both thought that if you want a person or an animal to stop doing something, then you don't have to punish that behavior. You just have to make sure that you're not reinforcing it. And so, in other words, Skinner and Thorndike thought that extinction was just as effective as punishment. And Skinner came to that conclusion on the basis of his own research with rats. And so, in that research, what he did was he first trained the rats to press a bar in a Skinner box. So, he reinforced them with food for doing that. Then he put one group of rats through extinction. So, they just didn't get food anymore after they pressed the bar. And he punished the other group of rats by having the bar sort of slap upward against their paws whenever they pressed it. And so in that second group, not only are they not getting the reinforcer now for pressing the bar, they're also getting this mild punisher in the form of that little slap. And as you can see in this cumulative record, the punished rats did show an immediate reduction in bar pressing compared to the extinction rats. However, when that punisher was removed, when the bar stopped slapping upward like that, those rats went back to pressing the bar. And by the end of the second day of the experiment, both groups of rats had made a roughly equal number of total bar presses. And so Skinner concluded that punishers only produce a temporary suppression of responding, and that in the long run, they're no more effective than extinction. That was Skinner's conclusion. But guys, the problem with that conclusion is that the punishers themselves were temporary. So the bar only slapped upward like that against the punished group's paws for 10 minutes, the first 10 minutes of the first day of the experiment. And after that, there were no more punishers. So after that first 10 minutes, the punished group and the extinction group were treated exactly the same. They both just didn't get reinforced anymore for pressing the bar. And so Skinner concluded that the effects of that punisher were temporary. He concluded that it only produced this temporary suppression of the bar pressing response. But the thing is, the effects of reinforcement are similarly temporary if the reinforcer stops occurring, like this punisher stopped occurring. So the increase in responding that reinforcement produces will also eventually extinguish, just like this decrease in responding eventually got extinguished. And so, as I've said here on the slide, modern psychologists largely disagree with Skinner's view on punishment. The evidence suggests that punishment can produce long term decreases in specific behaviors, so its effects don't seem to be any more temporary than those of reinforcement, and it can produce those decreases more effectively than simple extinction can. So, in other words, punishers do work. They can be effective in weakening a specific behavior as long as you apply them correctly. And so, what I want to do now is explain what I mean there by applying them correctly. So, now we're ready to go over some of those variables that influence how effective a certain punisher is. And, guys, as I think you'll see here, many of these factors are pretty intuitive. Okay. I don't think they'll surprise you too much. So, for example, take this first one, the severity of the punisher, the intensity of the punisher. All else equal, and as you'd probably expect, a bigger, more intense, more severe punisher is typically going to produce more effective suppression of the response than a weaker, milder punisher will. So, for example, this graph, which I took out of your book, is from an experiment where rats were first trained to press a lever for food. And then, once they'd acquired that behavior, lever pressing was punished by shocks of different intensities. So they used three different shock intensities in this study, and the control group just went through an extinction phase. And guys, what we're looking at here in the graph is something called suppression ratio. Okay, that's the dependent variable on which these groups are being compared. We're looking at the suppression ratio that each group of rats exhibited. And guys, the way suppression ratios work is you compare the number of responses that the animals make after an intervention to the number of responses that they were making at baseline before the intervention. So here we're looking at how many responses the animals made after they started getting punished compared to how many responses they made before the introduction of those punishers. And so the lower the suppression ratio is, then the more effective the punishment procedure was. And as you can see, the stronger shocks tended to produce more suppression than the milder shocks did. So those stronger shocks were more effective, right? They weakened the lever pressing response more effectively than the milder ones did. Now, of course, with this research, we're looking at the intensity of a positive punisher, right? We're considering the intensity of an electric shock, but the same principle holds for negative punishers. So, for example, all else equal, if you do something that you're not supposed to, and then your parents ground you for it for a month, well, you'll probably shape up and stop doing that thing faster than you would have if they had only grounded you for a weekend, right? So, the longer, more severe, more intense punisher would lead to a quicker change in your behavior than a shorter, less intense punisher would. So, the more intense the punisher, the more effective that punisher tends to be. But speaking of the intensity of the punisher, that brings up a problem with how punishers are often used in the real world, which is that in many cases, we tend to start off with fairly weak punishers, right? We often punish first offenses with the proverbial slap on the wrist with a pretty mild punisher. And then, if the behavior still persists, we move on to more intense punishers. Well, guys, the research suggests that that's actually a pretty bad way to administer punishers because previous exposure to mild punishers can actually make later, stronger ones less effective. So, for example, if you give a pigeon an 80-volt shock whenever it pecks a key, then that will be sufficient. That will be intense enough to make the pigeon stop pecking the key, but only if you use that 80-volt intensity right from the beginning of the punishment process. If instead you start off with less intense shocks and then you ramp them up from there, so if you gradually increase the intensity of the shocks up to the 80-volt level, then the pigeons will keep pecking. Then that 80-volt shock does not decrease the pecking behavior as effectively. So the pigeon's previous exposure to the milder shocks seems to make their behavior more impervious somehow to the stronger shock. And of course, one reason that might happen is because if you start with a mild punisher and then you gradually make it more intense, then the animal or the person can start to habituate to that punisher, right? With the end result being that to effectively weaken the behavior, you wind up having to use a more intense punisher than you otherwise would have. So there's a lesson in that, right? Which is that if you're going to use punishment, it's important to start with a punisher that is strong enough to weaken the behavior. It's counterproductive to work your way up to that point because that process of gradually increasing the severity makes it so that more intense punishers become less effective for that individual. And so, if you do start with just a little slap on the wrist, if you do start with a punisher that's too mild, then in the long run, you're probably not actually doing that individual any favors because it means that to actually eliminate the behavior, they're going to have to experience more total punishment and a more intense final punisher than they would have if you had used a sufficiently intense punisher to begin with. Now, of course, that begs the question of what is sufficiently intense to begin with, right? And as your textbook mentions, that's the rub. It's hard to say in advance how intense is intense enough. And so it's a tricky business. Getting it right as far as what intensity to start off with isn't always going to be an easy decision. But the point is, as far as these variables go that influence the effectiveness of a punisher, the introductory level of that punisher is a big one. That can have a pretty big impact. And guys, another thing that can have a pretty big impact on the effectiveness of a punisher is how immediate that punisher is. Or to put it the fancy way, how contiguous is the punisher with the behavior that you're trying to punish? How much contiguity is there between those two events, the response and the punisher? And again, as you'd probably expect, and just as we saw with reinforcers, punishers also tend to be more effective when they're given immediately than they are when they're delayed. And you can see that in this graph. So in this study, all of the rats got the same intensity of shock, but the researchers varied the contiguity of the shock with the bar pressing response. Some rats got shocked immediately after they pressed the bar. Others got shocked after delays of various lengths. And as you can see, there's a pretty orderly relationship here where the more you delay that punisher, the less effective it becomes at suppressing the response that you're trying to suppress. And of course, that could be the case for a couple of reasons. For one thing, the animal could just sort of forget that it even performed the behavior that you're actually trying to punish. But for another thing, the animal is obviously going to be doing other stuff during the delay, right? It's going to perform other behaviors during the time that passes between the target behavior and the punisher. And since those other behaviors are going to wind up being more contiguous with the punisher, it could wind up being those behaviors that the animal learns to suppress instead. So, in other words, the animal could sort of come to a false conclusion, kind of like we talked about with superstition, that it's actually this other behavior that caused the punisher to occur. So, guys, this is why it's really important when you're housebreaking a pet, when you're sort of potty training a pet so that it relieves itself outside rather than inside, that you catch it in the act, so to speak. You want to catch it in the act, right? So if you're going to punish your dog somehow for peeing on your carpet, then you want to administer that punisher right after the dog pees, right? You want that punisher to get delivered right after the dog performs this behavior of peeing on your carpet. Because you can't explain to your dog that you're really punishing it now for something it did an hour ago. And so, if too much time passes between when the dog pees and when you scold it or whatever, then it's not going to know why you're scolding it. And it'll probably think that it's being punished for whatever it just did right before you scolded it. You know what I mean? So, your dog might be like, okay, I promise, no more scratching myself. I won't do that anymore. So again, it might sort of think that it's this other behavior that actually caused the punisher to occur. And so it might be that other behavior that it actually learns to suppress. But it'll still pee on your carpet because that long delay, that lack of contiguity between the behavior and the punisher will tend to make that punisher less effective. Even if you rub the dog's nose in it, by the way, that doesn't work. That doesn't make up for the delay. It might make your dog learn to fear you, but it won't make it learn to stop peeing on your carpet. And so, again, especially with animals, the more immediate the punisher is, the more contiguous that punisher is with the behavior that you're trying to punish, then the more effective that punisher is going to tend to be. So, more contiguity leads to more effectiveness. And we could say the same kind of thing about the contingency between a behavior and a punisher. The stronger that contingency is, the more effective the punishment. So, non contingent punishers are typically ineffective. And you can see that in this graph, which is also from your book. So in this one, this NC group received non-contingent shocks. Okay, so they just got shocked periodically, regardless of what they were doing. Their shocks were not contingent at all on their behavior. And as you can see, the rats in that group pressed the lever just about as much as a control group that didn't get shocked at all. So the contingency matters between a behavior and a punisher. And again, the stronger that contingency is, the better the job that punisher tends to do as far as decreasing the behavior in question. And so if a behavior reliably produces the punisher every time it's performed, then that behavior will tend to become weaker more readily than it would have if it had only sometimes produced the punisher. So, in other words, the schedule of punishment matters, and a response tends to be suppressed more effectively with a continuous schedule of punishment than it does with a partial one. So, for example, this graph is a cumulative record from a study where pigeons first pecked a key for food on a variable interval schedule of reinforcement, and then each pigeon was also placed on one of several different fixed ratio schedules of punishment. And so those pigeons still got food on the VI schedule of reinforcement, but now every so many key pecks would also result in a punisher, an electric shock. And as you can see, the thinner the punishment schedule, the less suppression of the key pecking response these pigeons showed. So when an FR 1000 schedule of punishment was used, when the pigeons got shocked for every thousandth key peck, then their responding was suppressed by about 60%. When an FR 100 schedule was used, then responding was suppressed by about 80%. And when every response was punished, when a continuous FR1 schedule of punishment was used, then suppression was basically complete. There was nearly 100% suppression of the response in that case. So you can't even see that line in the cumulative record because it's right here on top of the horizontal axis. So, for a punisher to be effective, then it needs to be contingent on the response that you're trying to punish. There needs to be that causal relationship between performing the response and receiving the punisher. And again, the stronger that contingency is, the more consistently the punisher follows the behavior, then the more readily that behavior will tend to decrease. So, contiguity between the behavior and the punisher helps. A contingency between the behavior and the punisher also helps. But guys, one thing that can sort of undermine a punisher, make it less effective, is when the behavior that you're punishing also produces a reinforcer of some kind. And so, as I've said on the slide here, that simultaneous reinforcement of the punished behavior can wind up neutralizing or even counteracting the effects of the punisher. So, for example, let's say that after your dog chews on things that it's not supposed to chew on, you typically scold it. We'll say that that's the punisher that you typically administer as a consequence for that behavior. Well, your dog may not enjoy being scolded, but if it finds the attention from you to be rewarding in some sense, then it may continue to chew on your stuff because it's like the punishing consequence of that behavior is going up against and maybe even losing to this reinforcing consequence that the dog also gets for the same behavior. And, a punished child may continue to misbehave at home or in school for similar kinds of reasons, right? They may decide that it's worth it to endure the punisher. They may just sort of put up with the punisher in order to get the reinforcer that that same misbehavior also produces. So guys, let me show you a quick video here as an example of what I'm talking about with this simultaneous reinforcement of a punished behavior concept.
Jason was goofing off with his friends during math class. Mrs. Robbins told him to sit in the back of the class away from his friends. Jason went to the back of the class and just so happened to sit next to Jennifer, who he has had a crush on since first grade. Jason started goofing off in class more often after that, hoping to be sent to the back of the class again.
Okay, so in that example, the teacher is trying to punish the kid for goofing off, right? That's the intent. She wants to decrease the frequency of this behavior. But kind of like I just talked about with the dog example, even though the kid probably doesn't like getting yelled at by his teacher, that same behavior is also getting inadvertently reinforced here by the kid getting to sit next to this girl that he likes. And so, because of that simultaneous reinforcement that the kid is also receiving for this behavior, he may keep performing that behavior despite his teacher's attempts to punish it. So, guys, a related factor as far as the effectiveness of Punisher goes has to do with whether the person or the animal has any sort of alternative response that they can perform to obtain the reinforcer that's been maintaining this behavior that you're trying to punish. So, for example, in one study on this, smokers were seated in front of two levers that would both occasionally produce cigarettes when they were pulled. Okay. So, the cigarettes were the reinforcers in this experiment. And the smokers did learn to pull both levers, but then pulling one of the levers also started getting punished by a loud, annoying noise. Okay, so it would still produce the reinforcers. Pulling that lever would still produce cigarettes, but now it's also producing this punisher. It's producing this loud, aversive, buzzer type noise. And guys, there were two conditions during that punishment phase of the experiment. In one of them, both levers were available to the participants, with one producing the noise and the cigarettes, and the other one only producing the cigarettes. And in the other condition, only the punished lever was available. So in that condition, the other lever was inoperable, it was locked in place. And you can see the results of the experiment in this graph. So, as you can see, when they had an alternative way to get the cigarettes, the subjects almost never pulled that punished lever. But when they didn't, when pulling the punished lever was the only way for them to get cigarettes, well, then that loud, annoying sound was much less effective as a punisher, as evidenced by the fact that the subjects continued to pull that lever fairly often in that condition. And so, guys, findings like this bring up a pretty important principle with punishment, which is that it's a good idea to combine the punishment of an inappropriate behavior with the reinforcement of a more acceptable, more appropriate alternative. So, for punishment to work best, it's often important to figure out what it is that's been maintaining this behavior. What is the reinforcer that's been motivating this behavior in the first place so that you can provide another way for the person or the animal to get that reinforcer? So, for example, if your dog is chewing stuff that it shouldn't be chewing, then you could give it something more acceptable to chew on, like a bone or a toy of some sort. If it's chewing things because it gets reinforced by the attention it gets from you, then you could try to reinforce it with attention when it does other things instead. Or in the case of a child misbehaving in school, you will be more successful in eliminating whatever that problematic behavior is by providing the child with other ways to get the reinforcers that they're after. So, for example, in that video from before, the teacher is obviously going to want to stop reinforcing the kid like that for goofing off by letting him sit next to the girl that he likes. So, she definitely needs to use a different punisher for that behavior. But she could also make it so that when he does his work, or when he pays attention in class, or when he stays on task, or when he raises his hand before he talks, or whatever, when he does the things that she actually wants him to do, then that's when he gets the chance to sit by and socialize with his friends. Okay. So, guys, the basic idea here that I'm talking about is that we don't just want to be telling someone what not to do, right? By punishing them for inappropriate behavior. We also want to reinforce an alternative. We want to reinforce a more appropriate behavior because that way we're basically telling them, here, do this instead, right? And again, that tends to make the punisher more effective. That is a more effective way to get the person or animal to stop doing whatever it is you want them to stop doing. Okay? Well, guys, your book briefly mentions a few other variables that also influence the effectiveness of the punisher. But I want to wrap up this video lecture with one that the book doesn't mention, which is that it's often helpful to provide some kind of verbal rationale, some kind of explanation for why the punisher occurred. Now, obviously, you can't do that with animals, right? So, with animals, immediate punishers are especially important because you need them to recognize that contingency on their own between doing this thing and receiving this punisher. But as long as your subject does have the capacity for language, you can make a punisher more effective by explaining why it occurred, why it was administered. And guys, this was shown pretty conclusively in the study that I took this graph from, which involved second grade children who got punished with a medium intensity noise or a high intensity noise if they touched a toy. And some of those children were also given verbal reprimands that were along the lines of don't touch. Okay. So some of the kids didn't get punished at all for touching the toy, others did. And some of those kids were also told verbally not to touch the toy. And then later, each kid was left alone in a room that had the toy in it, and the researchers measured how long the kids held out, basically, before they touched this forbidden toy. So, how much time passed before they touched the toy? What was the latency of that response? And as you can see in the graph, when no reprimand was given, then the louder noise, the more intense punisher, was the most effective at suppressing that toy touching behavior. But not only did the verbal reprimand increase the effectiveness of the punishment across the board at each level of intensity, but the punishment was the most effective by far when the medium intensity noise was used rather than the higher intensity one. So, guys, one important takeaway from findings like this is that not only can providing a verbal rationale like that make a punisher more effective, it also seems like it might allow you to get away with using a less intense punisher than you'd otherwise have to. Okay, so there are lots of different variables out there that can influence the effectiveness of a punisher. And again, contrary to what Skinner and Thorndike thought, punishers can weaken a behavior more effectively than simple extinction can, as long as you're applying those punishers correctly. So, as long as they are sufficiently intense right from the outset, as long as they're contiguous with the behavior, as long as they're contingent on the behavior, and so on. So, they do work. Punishers do work, they are effective. But of course, no discussion of punishment will be complete without also mentioning the problematic side effects that can result from punishment. And so that is the topic of my next video lecture. That's going to do it for this one, though. So please let me know if you have any questions, and I hope you have a great day. Take care.